Welcome to the Millionaire Next Door podcast with Robert Curtis, CFP accredited investment fiduciary from Signature Estate and Investment Advisors. In this podcast, we help successful wealth accumulators like you looking to transition to a work-optional lifestyle by helping you build strategies for growing and maintaining your wealth. Robert draws from years of experience and fiduciary responsibility and interviews guest experts to help you build reliable strategies to grow and maintain your wealth. Now, on to the show.
Well, welcome back to the Millionaire Next Door podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. Today we have a guest I'm definitely excited about. It's an area that we've never really covered and one that hadn't occurred to me that much until I had a conversation with our guest. Our guest is Fahi Takesh Hallin. She is a partner at the law firm of Harris Ginsburg in Los Angeles, California. They are a very esteemed family law firm, very well known in Southern California and really nationally. Fahi is a family law attorney. She's a specialist. I'll introduce her in 1 second. Just a little bit of background here. Originally, we were going to talk about family law and some areas around prenuptial agreements. As I spoke with Fahi, I learned that about a half of her business comes internationally. She actually tries cases or have tried cases at The Hague. And she told me that a big area of her practice is actual child abduction. And she's anxious to share her thoughts and her experience and wisdom on that. And so we've never gone there, but just a reminder, I have a very developed value-added support team. That's part of the value proposition I bring to clients. I really hope no one ever needs this, but I'm thinking if they do or someone does, it's important to know someone you can contact probably quickly to get some help in this space. So with that long-winded intro, Fahi, welcome.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you so much for having me today. Very excited to be here and to provide some information that people might find interesting.
Definitely. We really appreciate it. I'm going to let you just launch right into us. Maybe tell me about your background, your areas of focus, or just go right into whatever you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So having practiced family law in Los Angeles County for almost 30 years now, I've come across very interesting issues. I can never say that my work is boring. Sometimes it's just way too interesting. So there's lots of interesting things to talk about, and I'm happy to certainly come back and talk about prenuptial agreements as well. People find that fascinating too. So many marriages all over the place, of course. But you and I started talking about international travel and the abduction convention when we were talking about summer travel, since both of us were going to be traveling over the summer. And I know at the moment people are sort of finishing up summer trips and maybe planning trips for winter breaks with kids and thereafter spring break and probably next summer. And so I'm often asked a lot of questions about children doing international travel. And one thing that comes up a lot is whether one parent can travel with the children to other countries temporarily and what they need to do that. So it does not happen too often, but when one parent only is traveling with a child, the airlines will often, or maybe the staff at an airport will often ask for an affidavit of consent from the other parent who's not traveling with the child. And so oftentimes I have clients and I know friends and colleagues will have the other parent sign a form, and sometimes they notarize it saying I give consent for, my husband or wife or girlfriend to take our child to so-and-so country from this date to that date, and they'll be traveling alone with the other parent. The reason that the airports and airport personnel will ask for this often enough that you should have one of these with you in case you're stopped for it is because of international parental abduction. And actually, I started getting into doing that kind of work right in 1996 when I was first admitted to practice family law, because the U.S. Department of State has a lot of referrals and is the main contact in the U.S. handling international abduction issues. So briefly, by way of background, there is an international treaty that was created at The Hague in 1981. And that convention is with respect to international parental abduction, and it aims to protect children from the effects of international abduction by one of their parents. So the treaty, the Hague Treaty, is a document where at the moment, it's 96 countries around the world have come together and signed an agreement which encourages prompt return of children to their countries of habitual residence and aims to ensure that the proper court decides any custody and visitation matters. So while the treaty was first introduced at The Hague, I don't actually even need to try cases there, because what the Hague Treaty does is that it allows all of the member countries, the 96 of them, to appoint their local government. It usually is, it's called the central authority in each country, to administer and deal with any child abductions. So if someone brings a child to your country from their habitual residence, meaning where they have lived up until then, the central authority in a country will take a request by you for the return of the child back to the country where the child was living. And so that's a very useful tool. And I wanted to give everybody a resource so that they can find which countries are currently on the list and get some more information about international parental abduction. And that's the U.S. State Department's website. You just go to travel.state.gov or just type in international parental abduction when you're in the search bar at the U.S. State Department's website, and it'll take you to the Hague Convention treaty partners. The reason that I have friends and clients look up the countries pretty often is because they're wondering, hey, should I go ahead and travel to this country with my child, or allow the other parent to travel to a country with that child? And so if you look it up, and let's say your child is going to the Bahamas, or somebody wants them to go to the Bahamas with the other parent, you can look it up and see, yes, the Bahamas is on the list. It'll even tell you the year that the Bahamas came a part of the treaty. So for example, I just pulled it up for this, and it says Bahamas became treaty partners in 1994. The U.S. has been a partner since 1981, pretty much the inception. So we've been quite forward-facing with that. A lot of times people will give permission to a parent to take a child to another country, let's say to visit relatives, or to stay there for the summer, or maybe even stay there for a period of months, like a foreign study program. And that's all good, but then the parent won't return them. So the good thing is that the treaty aims to deal with children who've not only been taken to another treaty country, but also what they call wrongfully withheld, meaning they were there, they were allowed to be there, but then when summer ended or when the vacation ended, they retained them there. So the Hague Treaty and the convention that's set up to deal with it will also authorize the central authority to help you get the return of the child back to the country where they live.
When you say child, is it through age 18, or what defines a child?
You know, that's actually a really good question, because the treaty actually will allow children who are younger to make their own decision. So this really applies to more younger kids, age 0 until about 10, and certainly age 16. Anything over and above that, you would have to go to the local courts in the country where the child is to try to make a custody request. Obviously, yeah, the thought is that the local courts might side on the side of the person who's brought the child there. Oftentimes they're from that country, and there's quite a bit of home courting or wanting to have the child stay if it's through the local courts. But if the local courts are hearing a Hague case, there's a lot less of that, and the Hague case is there and designed to return the children to the place of their habitual residence.
Wow, so interesting. Yeah, my daughter, she's 19, not traveling with children, but she's getting ready to do an educational thing in about 4 or 5 countries in Central and South America. So just kind of brought that up. I love that State Department site, and we might be able to get that in the show notes, which would be great, but you sold it out pretty well. And interestingly, this podcast, as I understand it, this podcast listened to in 112 countries. So there's people all over the world listening to this thing. So
Pulled it up on the travelstate.gov website. It's actually on the main ribbon. It starts with, on the left side, U.S. passports, international travel, U.S. visas, intercountry adoption, and then international parental abduction. So unfortunately, it's that common and that much of a problem that it has its own banner on the U.S. Department website.
Wow. Are there any red flags that could signal abduction is being planned by a parent?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's certain things that a court will look at when, let's say, the parents are in litigation and somebody wants to go on vacation. There's certain red flags that they do look at. Number one is whether the parent has ties to another country. So, for example, it might be their country of origin. They might have family there. They'll look at whether somebody has recently stopped their ties or really hindered their ties to this country or wherever the child was living. For example, did they recently quit their job? Did they recently give up their home or apartment? And another red flag could certainly be that there's major conflict between the parents. And parents, have said things to each other like, oh, I never want you to see the child again. And they're really not on the same page. So the level of conflict really is something that's part of the red flag. But I can tell you that the courts really do take into consideration, really around the world, whether the proposed country is part of the Hague Treaty. And for anyone who's wondering, hey, what can I do if the country that a child is taken to is not part of the Hague Treaty, the U.S. Department of State will do something called a welfare and institutions check. So they will go to other countries that have consular officers and other agents, and will do a welfare check and check on the children. So, for example, I had a client whose kids were kidnapped to Egypt at one point. That was the children's father's basically ancestral country. And we did have the State Department go out there and do a welfare check. They knocked on the door where the kids were staying with their dad and grandparent and checked on them for us. We did get lucky, though, that dad agreed to bring the children back finally after we had to get a court order and write to them incessantly voluntarily. So there are things that can be done if your country at issue is not part of this convention. It's got a lot less teeth.
Oh, that makes sense. I don't know this area, but I'm thinking all of a sudden if the local government officials come knocking on the door for a welfare check, it kind of puts that parent on notice. Hey, this has been flagged. Somebody's watching. You're not off the grid here. We know you've got the child and we're checking in on you.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. It's a deterrent. It probably was in that case too.
Yeah. Are there any time limits to seeking return of a child?
That's another really good question. And that has changed in the last 5 or so years. So it used to be that there was not really a time limit. However, the case law has changed, and that's international case law that applies kind of no matter what state you're in or country. Case law has now changed to where if you don't bring the application for the return of the child or children within 1 year, then you're barred from bringing it. And that's quite unfortunate. And it's going to be 1 year from the date of the wrongful removal or retention. So if you agree that the child can go for, a year abroad, it's not going to start counting until the day they were supposed to come back. But that's actually a real issue. And the reason it's a real issue is because in the US, parties can file their own Hague applications with the local courts, which is great. But in other areas, or maybe in some of the states here, they have to rely on the local central authority, the local people who have been tasked with carrying out the abduction hearings to actually file the case. So if they don't start early enough, they might be running into that 1 year deadline. So that's really important. Yeah, I would certainly tell people to file right away, because if the child is a little bit older, I don't know, maybe 7, 8, 9, one of the exceptions to the treaty will apply, and that's the well-settled doctrine. So if the court finds that a child is quote unquote well settled in the forum state, the state where they've been, and state applies to foreign countries as well, state where they have been abducted to, then the court may decide not to return the child or children. So for both of these reasons, A, the time limit and the fact that your central authority might not be moving fast, and B, because you don't want an argument, oh, the children are well settled here, you need to file immediately if there has been an abduction. Don't let the other side kind of sweet talk you into kind of giving in and letting it go on for longer. I had a case where mom and dad lived in Europe and had a child there, and mom had ties to California. She asked dad, oh, can I go for a visit and see, grandparents? And he said yes. And then while she was gone, she said, oh, by the way, I want to end the marriage. And can I stay here another month? Can I stay another 2 months? Can I stay 3 months? And he had said okay to all of these, because she said, what I'm doing is I'm going to think about whether the marriage will work out. And he was very hopeful that they would be able to stay together. So he didn't take legal action against her. And she sort of sweet talked him into being here for 6 months. And 6 months is a key time period in the US, because in the US, we have a Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction and Enforcement Act, which allows a state to basically find that a child is a local resident if they've been there for 6 months. And so that's really important, and underscores the need to take fast action if you have a child who's been abducted or know someone who's dealing with that. Don't try to deal with it just on your own or through kind of messages with the other party. You do have to take legal action. Otherwise, you might be sitting on those rights and not be able to get the child back home.
Wow.
Rob, when you mentioned the length of time that you have to bring such an application, it also made me want to discuss the length of time that the process takes. And I'll tell you, that's sort of one of our weaknesses in terms of executing these Hague return hearings. So, and it's sort of all over the place. So even though the treaty itself says that the aim is to secure a prompt return of children who have been taken or retained in another country, these processes actually are not prompt. They're supposed to be maybe 5 or 6 weeks, because the court systems all over the place, not just in the US, but in international countries, are oftentimes overrun. They don't have a lot of funding, and they have a lot of people they have to take care of. So it might be a long time before a hearing is set. I would say in California, if you bring a case in state court, you're looking at maybe 3-4 months at minimum. Oftentimes we have to go back and finish up a hearing if it doesn't finish that day. And that's how it is sort of around the country. But altogether, in terms of your first time that you go to the authorities and seek a return order to when the child is returned, it might be 6 months or even longer. I can tell you that countries
Wow.
that are trying to execute the Hague Abduction Convention are all working to try to make the timeline to be less, to basically follow the rules and the requirements that it be a prompt return. And so everyone is aware of the delay problem and working on it diligently to try to make it happen as quickly as possible.
That's super interesting. I'm just thinking in the broader context, of society now and emails and texting, and people want things done fast and they're used to it. Amazon, right? Sometimes the package comes the same day, the next day. But here,
Right.
Nothing's going to happen fast, and you got to deal with that's the environment. And in a stressful situation with big stakes, that's got to be a challenge, I would think. Wondering if how do you see the children react? Do they understand why they're coming back? Do they want to come back? What do abducting parents tell them?
It really varies with the case and the situation. Sometimes children are extremely young, and so they really have no idea what happened. I had a case that was between here and Sweden where the kids were basically newborn and toddler age, so they had no idea what happened to them and sort of what they went through. Some kids are a little bit older. It really all comes down to who is talking to them and what they're saying. It's actually a problem that I have in dealing with family law cases and, what are parents telling their children when they're having high conflict with their ex or having a dispute with their spouse. And there are those who will always protect the children from their disputes with the other side, and there's always some people who try to adultify children and tell them all their feelings about the other party and tell them everything that's going on, which always includes their opinion about the other parent. And at the end of the day, that always ends up hurting the children because you're talking about the other parent and that's half the child. So you're sort of insulting half the child. It doesn't work out well at all for a child in the long run. So I have had, many cases where the abducting parent has said all sorts of things to the child, and the child may be weary of returning with the other parent, basically the victim, the other victim of the abduction. And so oftentimes what happens is that we'll have a court order that the abducting parent be the one who flies back with the children to the country of habitual residence. And then once they get back there, the local courts are the ones who are going to be determining who has custody at the end of the day. The Hague hearing does not actually determine who has custody. A lot of people think that it does, and that's a misconception. All it does is decide where the child was living at the time of abduction and order the return of the child there so that the parties can then sort out their differences in that location.
Interesting. And then if someone is going through this, you've listed the website as a resource, the State Department. What should they do? When should they reach out to you? What steps should they take if this occurs? What do you recommend?
So what I would say is no matter where people are, whether in the US or in any other country, the first thing you should do is to go to the local authorities. So go to the police and report the abduction. They may have a straight line to the central authority. And if they don't, they will point you to the right place to be able to begin the process. Go on the US State Department's website. It has all the resources that you need in terms of being able to start filling out the forms that the U.S. Central Authority will need in order to contact their local counterpart in the location. And same thing with, other countries. Go to your local police and law enforcement agency immediately. And they are tasked with pointing you to the right place to make your application. I also wanted to take a moment to talk about something I just touched on a few minutes ago, which are the exceptions to the return of the child. And the exceptions are, number one, that the person who was left behind was not actually having or exercising their custody rights. So, if it's somebody who hasn't seen the child in 7 years or has a custody order but was not seeing the child, that person's not going to be able to petition for the return. The second exception for the return is Article B, which is there's a grave risk of harm that the return would expose the child to physical or psychological harm, or otherwise place the child in an intolerable situation. Sometimes I've had war break out in the country that the child was taken from, and a court said, no, I'm not going to send you back to that location. Sometimes it's a place that's not safe, and that sort of was something that happened recently. So just because you lived in a country and you left and you don't want to be there anymore, you can't say, oh, it's not safe. It was if the child was already living there, but it really has to be something serious that happened there, or if there's a grave risk of harm, if there's been abuse. So that would have to be proved at the Hague hearing as well. We talked about the last and final exception earlier, which is that the child has attained an age of maturity and the child objects to the return. And so that's when, I think once the child starts reaching the age of 10, 11, 12, the court will take their wishes into consideration. That's assuming it hasn't been 1 year, the child is not well settled in the abducted to location.
Wow. Couple of questions just surfaced throughout that. Let me throw two out there. Do they have to be married? This couple is one. And then also, what is the toughest country to get a child back from?
So that's a good question. I would say number one, countries that are not part of the Hague Convention. So you go to the local courts and you say, hey, the child was living over there until 5 minutes ago when this guy abducted the child or this woman. So that's the most difficult, I would say. Number two is that we actually have a list, and there's a link to it from the same State Department website of basically a report card that the U.S. State Department puts together, and people in other countries can look at that report card and see sort of what is the compliance rate of these Hague Convention countries. How often are they actually sending the children back? I wouldn't get too alarmed necessarily by a completely negative history with a country, because perhaps the applications that were made were by parents seeking return to a country that the child was not habitually resident in, or it was more than 1 year, and that's why the child was not returned. But still, that's really good evidence and information. And what they do is that they release it every year. So we have a 2023 report. We have a report for every year prior to that for each country that was a member signatory. Some of the countries that have had problems with enforcement in the past have been Argentina, Japan, Germany, but I don't want to say that that's current information at all. You can look up the current information at any time using the links through the State Department's website to see what the current compliance rates are.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, Japan and Germany, very developed countries. Germany, right in the EU, but so
yeah,
interesting.
Very law, you think of them as very law-abiding countries. And for Japan, part of it has been that it only became recently a member of the treaty. And I think the judges and courts had been getting up to speed on it, for example. But it's good that you can look it up and sort of see what that is if you're really getting into the weeds of a dispute with another parent and they've shown other dangerous, usually abusive behavior in the past. Then you can certainly look up the record for the country that they're seeking to take the child to and say, oh, by the way, this country has returned the children after a Hague application has been filed 20% of the time only.
This is fascinating. Any sort of cases or situations, not discussing details that you can't share, but anything you really want to highlight, or other things that haven't come up that you think are key to mention? Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So my biggest tip for all parents, especially when you're no longer together with the other parent, is if you're authorizing the other parent to take the child somewhere, write down what your agreement is and have both of you sign it. It doesn't have to be a formal legal contract that you have to pay a lawyer for, but at least have an understanding, like a one pager that says such and such parent is taking the child on a trip. And these are the dates that are involved. Departure from this country on this date, return to this country on this date. So those are the most important things you want to have in the agreement, because that ends up always to be very powerful evidence, because as you can imagine, a person may retain the child somewhere else and then say, oh, we all agreed that, me and the child would move here. Hey, look, we bought a one-way ticket. And I've had cases where we've had to deal with saying, yes, that was a one-way ticket, but it was less expensive. And the other parent said, oh, I'll book the return ticket as well. And now they're only showing you half of the ticket, that kind of a thing. So make sure, the kids are flying on a round trip ticket. Make sure that you have a two-sentence agreement that both of you sign saying the trip will be from this date to that date, even if it's like a couple of months in the summer or for the school year. That's basically my biggest tip for parents. That's going to save everybody a lot of trouble and a lot of time in getting the children back to where they had been living.
That is a great tip. So one could handwrite that out. Does it need to be notarized or no?
The more formal it is, the better. So sure, if you can get it notarized, if you can have it typed, if you can even have lawyers involved, all the better. But oftentimes these trips, even with people who may not be getting along or may be separated, are sort of on the cuff and sort of last minute. So yeah, if all you have is a handwritten document that you both signed and it's not notarized, it's still very important. Put in your date of travel, going and return. It'll make a huge difference.
And so let's say they might not need you to do this, but let's say there were some red flags or there were some concerns, or the marriage had been full of conflict and someone was a little nervous about this. I'm thinking it would make sense to have someone like you draft this up and, provide the evidence and have it laid out from your perspective of all the things you've seen. Does that make sense? Or
yeah,
what?
I
Okay.
can tell you that I've been asked to come in the middle or toward the end of cases where a trial is about to happen, and I've really wished I was involved from the beginning so that I could help write the travel document. So I make sure that we say, the child's country where they live is X. They're just going to go for a temporary trip from this date to that date, and make sure that there's nothing else in there that sort of neutralizes what you just said in the prior sentence, for example. So yeah, I really wish in these cases that people would go to me or to another lawyer who has international experience, because then we can cut out a lot of need for attorney or court involvement in the future.
Yeah, that's so true. That's true in my case too. Earlier is better. And I remember do you remember this commercial for Fram, the oil filters? And the guy would say, you can pay me now or pay me later. I don't know if you remember that, with the implication being it's going to be a lot more expensive later.
Exactly.
That popped into my head. Anything else? I mean, you are a complete wealth of information. I have learned so much, and I think our listeners have, in these tips and just an awareness of the issue that I didn't even have. So and you offered right from the get-go to maybe come back. We would love to have you back. Any other topic, if you could make it half or a third as interesting as this, man, let's schedule it. That would be amazing. But
absolutely, it's my pleasure.
That's fantastic. Any other closing thoughts or things we didn't cover, or things you want to just impart on us before we kind of land the plane here?
I think we covered it for now, but any additional resources that people who are listening may need, go to the U.S. State Department's website, go to your country's, equivalent resources, and don't be afraid to ask the questions. Don't be afraid to bring an application if you're in this situation. You definitely don't want to kind of sit on your rights and have your other person be able to make decisions that are unilateral with regard to a child simply because you didn't take the action quick enough.
That is great. We'll try and get some of those links into the show notes. We'll put your contact info. The audience, it's really interesting. There's a lot of folks all over the world. There's a lot of other professionals, attorneys, accountants, people dealing with estates who may, so that's kind of a network for them to connect with you. That you're always welcome to reach out to me, and I can connect you to Fahi or contact her directly at her office. Fahi, this has been fantastic. I wasn't sure where I was going to go with this, but it was just absolutely great. So, and I hope no one really ever has a need in this area, but if it comes up, you've got some background and some resources. And this is an evergreen part of the podcast, is to make these sort of evergreen resources, meaning this is just not relevant for late August 2024 when we're recording this, but 2-3 years down the line, if something surfaces, this can be referenced. So folks hearing this, hopefully you listen, and then you can share that going forward if it does come up. If you're at a event with family or friends and all of a sudden you're at a barbecue and someone mentions a crazy case, you'll say, boy, you ought to listen to this podcast and get these resources. So I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your wisdom, and it's been great. So thank you so much, Fahi.
My pleasure, Rob. Thank you. And thank you for your podcast, which I've been listening to as well, and is such a fun and enlightening listen.
I really, really appreciate it. So thanks for listening. Let me know maybe privately. I'd love to hear if there's any that really jumped out at you. It's definitely been a journey. Started this during COVID lockdown. Had no idea if I'd even have success as a podcaster. And then, topics like this are coming up. We interviewed an Olympic mogul skier on the topic of fear. There's some really interesting stuff I have coming up too. So if you have any suggestions or ideas, please let us know. So Fahi, this is great. I'm going to let you get on with your day and the listeners move on. I hope everyone makes it a great day. Thanks again. We'll continue to, share good info. And again, we have a very refined and optimized process, but we're never satisfied with just the status quo. We're always trying to make it a little bit better. And I feel like this has sort of introduced a new element to my skill set as a professional that I could share if it were to ever come up now or somewhere down the line. So I'm really, really grateful. So thanks, everyone. Make it a great day.
Thank you for listening to the Millionaire Next Door podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available.
The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Signature Estate and Investment Advisors. Signature Estate and Investment Advisors, LLC, SEIA, is an SEC-registered investment advisor. However, such registration does not imply a certain level of skill or training, and no inference to the contrary should be made. Securities offered through Signature Estate Securities LLC, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through SEIA LLC, 2121 Avenue of the Stars, Suite 1600, Los Angeles, California, 90067. Telephone number 310-712-2323.
All investing involves risk. Past performance does not indicate future results. Specific products discussed are not suitable for all investors.